Hello students, and welcome back to another lecture for Core 201. So today we're going to continue our talk about John Locke. So we are reading 2 treatises on government, and the stuff that we talked about last week was mostly in regard to Locke's state of nature, which as you may recall was a lot more peaceful than Hobbes. It basically said that men are naturally free and naturally equal, and that they should take care of each other if they can. And we talked about Locke's idea about government. So he said that essentially no government is legitimate unless the people who are in the government agreed to it. So his argument was that essentially monarchies are illegitimate because nobody agreed to that. But democracies are legitimate because a bunch of people came together on purpose and made a government. So now that we know what he thinks the government should look like, we're going to talk about how we should build one and how it should be designed to give the best possible freedom to all its citizens. So let's get started. So today we begin with Chapter 9, of the ends of political society and government. So keep in mind, he's not talking about the end like this is the end point, it's over now. He's talking about the end more like Aristotle's version of the end. What is the goal of political society and government? Essentially, the telos, which should sound familiar. So here in this chapter, he's essentially talking about why would we bother? Why would anyone bother having a political society, having a government? Like, what's the purpose? What's the point of all of this? So he starts with a pretty good question, which is, why would you leave the state of nature? The state of nature is pretty chill. Everybody's free, everybody's equal, everybody's basically running free in the plains like wild horses. So the question is, why would you bother to leave something like that and move to society? And this is what he says, that basically it's dangerous out there. The enjoyment of property he has in this state, this is the state of nature, is very unsafe, very unsecure. This makes him willing to quit a condition which, however free, is full of fears and continual dangers. So even though the state of nature is really nice and it's very beautiful out there, it's also dangerous. There's bears. They're going to come to your tent and eat your dinner and take your sleeping bag. So one of the reasons that he argues that we leave the state of nature and enter into society is because the state of nature is dangerous. Another reason that we might leave the state of nature and come into society is because it offers us some protection. So next he gets into this idea that we want to protect ourselves and our property. So first he starts with the concept of mutual protection. The great and chief end, therefore, of men's uniting into commonwealths and putting themselves under government is the preservation of their property. So essentially his argument here is that it was unsafe in nature and it's safe in society because we have a government, we have the means of protecting ourselves. And I want to tell you one thing about property here. He's not necessarily talking about like land, physical property. Essentially his definition is our lives, our liberties, and our estates. So yes, there's the property aspect of like owning an estate, but also when he talks about the things that we want to protect, he's also talking about our literal lives and our natural liberties. So for him, even though he does use the word property, he's also talking about this idea that we have things that are intrinsic to us, and we want to protect those things. And one of the best ways of protecting those things is entering into a society. But before we enter into a society, we have a few demands. So let's look at a few of the things that are on John Locke's list of demands. First, laws. So the first thing he says we need to do is establish a set of laws. First, there wants an established, known, and settled law, received and allowed by common consent, to be the standard of right and wrong, and the common measure to decide all controversies between them. So this may sound familiar. This is something that a couple of our other authors have said so far. Essentially, we need some laws, but those laws need to be standard for every person who's under them. They need to make sense. They need to be known, promulgated, and they have to have essentially someone to enforce them. They exist, so the next thing we need, a fair judge. I don't know this judge, but he seems very fair. So in regard to a fair judge, his argument is that now that we have the laws, someone has to uphold them. Secondly, a known and indifferent judge, with authority to determine all differences according to the established law. So again here, he's being quite careful with his definitions. We know what the laws are, they've been promulgated, so we need a fair and indifferent person to decide controversies. We need someone who will uphold the law and who will do it with as much fairness and indifference as possible. Because like we've talked about before, a biased judge could really cause a lot of problems. The third thing that we need are people to sort of enforce the rules outside of the courtroom. Thirdly, power to back and support the sentence when right, and to give it due execution. So here he's talking about the people who are going to uphold what the judge said, the people who are going to uphold what the laws already said. So even if we have laws and a judge, that doesn't mean that we follow the laws all the time, because we might not get in trouble if we break it. Or even if we're sentenced and we're found guilty, we might not have that sentence carried out, because who's going to do it? So his argument is that we need people who can back the law and support the law, but also people who can back the judge and support the judge. So you need people that you can turn to, both when you're in trouble and after you've passed a sentence. So for Locke, he calls it power to back and support, and for me, I'm going to go ahead and call it courts and police. Now, one thing that's tricky about giving power to the courts and the police is that you don't have it yourself anymore. So remember, in the state of nature, pretty much everybody is the judge, jury, and executioner. If somebody wrongs you, you can just do whatever you feel like you need to do. But in the society, it's a little bit different. So one of the things that he says that we have to give up in exchange for this protection is our right to defend ourselves the way that we see fit. So he says, we have to give up the right to do whatsoever he thinks fit for the preservation of himself and others. So essentially, you can't just shoot people because they looked at you wrong. And the power to punish crimes committed. So if you think your next door neighbor has committed a crime, you can't kill them yourself. So this probably seems quite reasonable to us. We're used to leaving our problems to the authorities. But his argument was, in the state of nature, there weren't any authorities, so this is something we're giving up, the power to sort of seek justice ourselves. We also get a reward when we give something like this up. And the reward that he describes sounds pretty nice. A new state, wherein he is to enjoy many conveniences from the labor, assistance, and society of others in the same community, as well as protection from its whole strength. So yeah, we gave up some of our freedoms, but one of the things that we're getting is the strength of the community. We get help from everybody else. We're able to trade, we're able to exchange services, we're able to ask for favors, and that has a lot of power. One of the main things that's great about living in society is that you have so many other people to help you. And so you can help each other inside the community, but he also notes that you can help each other protect from outside the community. So if you and your community are being attacked, now you have a whole bunch of people to help you. And that also has a lot of power. So this is essentially the thesis statement of the whole chapter. He is to part with as much of his natural liberty in providing for himself as the good, prosperity, and safety of the society shall require, which is not only necessary, but just, since the other members of the society do the like. So essentially, when you do enter into the society, not only do you give up some of your personal freedoms, but you start to act for the good of the society. So previously, you were acting for the good of yourself. There was only you, maybe your family, and you did whatever you had to do to protect you and your family. But now, you are acting for the good of society. You are doing what you can for the good, prosperity, and safety of everybody else too. This is a pretty big trade-off. Again, previously, you were living in a state of nature. You could do what you felt was necessary. But when you join a society, you have to let go of certain things. You have to let go of some freedoms to get some safety in exchange. But the thing that's really key here is that so does everyone else. The equality here is vital. So the same way that you have given up some of your freedoms, so too have all of your neighbors. In the state of nature, you could kill somebody for looking at you. In society, you can't. But neither can they kill you. So it's a big trade-off, but ultimately it ends up with some equality and a healthier society. So next, we turn to the very beautifully named Chapter 12, of the legislative, executive, and federative power of the Commonwealth. So what's going to happen in Chapter 12 is that Locke is going to tell us how he thinks we should divide up power in a government. And as you may recall, the very concept of dividing up power is itself kind of new. So we start with the legislative branch. The legislative power is that which has a right to direct how the force of the Commonwealth shall be employed for preserving the community and the members of it. So parts of this should sound familiar. The idea that people should make laws, and those laws should be aimed at protecting the community, and that they should be done for the greater good. But there's something new here, and that's the force of the community, essentially the power of the people. No one has yet recognized the great power that people have in a democracy. A few people have, they've talked about, in fact, the downfall of giving the poor that much power. But for Locke, he's talking about the good parts of giving people that much power. So he's arguing that essentially the people carry force. They have the force of the Commonwealth. And one of the jobs of the legislative branch is to use that force for good. So that's what the legislative branch does. But it's important to note that they are subject to the laws that they make. The legislative power is put into the hands of diverse persons who, duly assembled, have by themselves or jointly with others the power to make laws, which, when they have done, being separated again, they are themselves subject to the laws they have made. So there's kind of a lot going on here, but basically, the people get together, there's a diverse group of them. What diverse means to John Locke is different than what it means to us today, but whatever. They make the laws, but then they go back home. They essentially become private citizens again. So he's really careful to note that just because you're one of the people who makes the laws does not mean you are above the laws. This is a bit of a little shout out to Montesquieu, who was one of the people that sort of promulgated this idea that perhaps the people who make the laws should also be subject to the laws, in part to make sure that the laws were good and they're not just handing down a bunch of nonsense to keep people disempowered. So when they were writing the Constitution, they kept this idea. Basically, the people who make the laws are subject to the laws, but they did put in one exception, and you may remember this from Article 1. They shall, in all cases, except treason, felony, and breach of peace, be privileged from arrest during their attendance at the session of their respective houses and in going to and returning from the same. The idea behind this part of the Constitution was that they didn't want people getting arrested because they were making laws that other people disagreed with. Because this had happened. This still happens. People do fall down elevator shafts when they make laws that some people don't like. But the idea with this is that basically you can't arrest somebody, especially on spurious charges, just because you're afraid of what they're going to do when they get to work. So you can arrest them if they do something terrible, treason, felony, breach of the peace, but you can't arrest them for having a taillight out because you're afraid that when they get there, they're going to do something you don't like. So that's the one exception in regard to lawmakers being sort of above the law. There's another sort of fuzzy exception that we're working with in modern America. Essentially, members of Congress are exempt from these two things. From the Occupational Safety and Health Act of 1970, which you may know as OSHA, there's probably posters wherever you work on the walls that say, you can't be in dangerous circumstances without suing your boss. And they're also, weirdly, not subject to the Freedom of Information and Privacy Act. So you can essentially demand to know what the government knows about you, but you can't demand to know what the government knows about your Congress members, or necessarily what they're doing behind closed doors. So they do have a few exceptions that give them a little bit of power. But I want to be clear. They're not exempt from all the laws. For instance, they're not exempt from insider trading. This was apparently unclear to our representatives in Georgia, and they're currently being federally prosecuted. Next, Locke moves into another idea which should sound familiar, but which at the time was still kind of uncommon: breaking up the power. Essentially, the separation of powers into different branches of government. So this is what he says about that. Because it may be too great a temptation to human frailty, apt to grasp at power, for the same persons who have the power of making laws to have also in their hands the power to execute them, whereby they may exempt themselves from obedience to the laws they make and suit the law to their own private advantage, thereby coming to have a distinct interest from the rest of the community, contrary to the end of society and government. So essentially what he's saying here is that you can't always trust humans to make good decisions when they have too much power. So very similar to what Montesquieu was talking about in the exercises that we did in class. If the same person has the power to make the laws and enforce the laws, that can go wrong real fast. So he says, essentially, that if you give the people the power to make and execute the laws, they might design the laws in their own favor. In fact, they might make so many laws that are in their own interest that they're not even making laws that are in the interest of the greater good. Or they might make laws that benefit them, but kind of leave everybody else out to dry. This may sound familiar. So he thinks that we should break those powers up, that the same people who make the laws shouldn't execute the laws. Enter the executive branch. So Locke's idea here is that we'll just sort of break some of the power off and give it to a different branch. But because the laws that are at once and in a short time made have a constant and lasting force and need a perpetual execution, therefore it is necessary that there should be a power always in being, which should see to the execution of the laws that are made and remain in force. And thus, the legislative and executive powers come often to be separated. So one of the things that he's talking about here is that the legislative branch is not always in session. They come together, they make the laws, they go back home. And this could be a little bit dangerous, because what if they're not in session when the law needs to be executed? So he's saying there should be one power that's always on the clock, one power that's essentially always in office. And that is what we ended up doing with the executive branch. So he says essentially, we need somebody who's always on the clock, and we need to sort of keep the power moderate between the branches. So that's where we come up with the executive. Next, Locke focuses on the federative power. And this may not sound familiar, and that's in part because we didn't use this part. But he says, this, therefore, contains the power of war and peace, of leagues and alliances, and all the transactions with persons and communities without the Commonwealth. So here he's saying that we need, again, two different branches to deal with two different things. But in this case, he's talking about problems inside the community and problems outside the community. So he says that essentially we need an executive branch for all the stuff that happens inside. It's like part of our government, but we need a federative branch for all the stuff that happens outside. For defense, for alliances, for treaties, basically to split those two powers so that we don't have one person having too much. Again, we didn't quite go with this, and in part because of what Locke said, which is that it might be too much hassle to have this in the hands of two different people. Though, as I said, the executive and federative power of every community be really distinct in themselves, it is almost impractical to place the force of the Commonwealth in distinct and not subordinate hands, or that the executive and federative powers should be placed in persons that might act separately. So here he deals with kind of three issues. One, it's kind of impractical to expect the same thing to be dealt with by two different people. Two, if it is dealt with by two different people, you run the risk of one being subordinate to the other. And who should be more powerful? I don't know. The person who deals with outside problems, the person who deals with inside problems. You don't want them to necessarily get in a power struggle. And then three, if they are two separate people, you run the risk of them making different kinds of decisions. So if the person who's settling disputes inside the community has a vastly different way of doing things than the person who settles disputes outside the community, you could end up with a lot of confusion. So ultimately, he thinks we should combine these two powers, the executive and the federative, together. And so that brings us to chapter 13, of the subordination of powers of the Commonwealth. So very much like Montesquieu, first he deals with the idea that we should separate the powers, and second he deals with the idea that some of them might have more power than others. Remember how with Montesquieu it became sort of a complex game of rock, paper, scissors? For Locke, kind of the same idea. So first we deal with the voters. And again, this is what's unusual about Locke, his recognition that the citizens have actual power. So here's what he says. There remains still in the people a supreme power to remove or alter the legislative when they find the legislative act contrary to the trust reposed in them. So here he's saying that if you have a democracy, specifically a representative democracy, if the people that you've chosen to be your representatives are doing a bad job and they're acting contrary to the trust you placed in them, you can get rid of them. And again, this is unusual, to give the power to just boring old, plain old citizens. But he's acknowledging here that they are doing a job. The citizens elected you, and the citizens can fire you. So that means that the citizens have to kind of keep an eye on the people who are making the laws and see if they're doing something good. And this next part, I think, might feel kind of timely. And thus, the community perpetually retains a supreme power of saving themselves from the attempts and designs of anybody, even of their legislators, whenever they be so foolish or so wicked as to lay and carry on designs against the liberties and properties of the subject. So, even if you are an official, and even if you have the power to make laws, if you do something that is wicked or foolish, if you do something that goes against the best interests of your citizens, you're out. This is very powerful stuff. And as we enter into one of the most hotly contested presidential campaigns of our time, this is powerful stuff. One of the things that Locke wants to be especially clear about is that humans have natural rights, and they must always have the power to preserve those rights. So for him, voting is an act of power, but it's also an act of preservation. They will always have a right to preserve what they have not a power to part with, and to rid themselves of those who invade this fundamental, sacred, and unalterable law of self-preservation for which they entered into society. So again, he thinks that one of our natural rights is essentially to stay alive. And if someone is doing something that interferes with that right, or if they're doing something that interferes with our right of liberty, we have to interfere right back. So for Locke, very often, voting and controlling the legislation is an act of self-preservation. And that leads us to one of my favorite quotes from this whole thing. Thus the community may be said in this respect to always be the supreme power. I know, right? But I want you to remember this, especially this week, but also for the rest of your life. It's you that has the power. It's the voters and the citizens who have the power. And the system was designed that way. The power is always supposed to be in the people, and not in the legislature, and not in the executive. They can't be trusted. They're just humans. The power must always be held by the community and wielded by the community when we vote. Okay, now our game of rock, paper, scissors gets a little more complicated. Always, the citizens have the most power, but within the branches of government, the legislators have a lot of power. So Locke says, in all cases, while the government subsists, the legislative is the supreme power. So this kind of answers our question from a couple weeks ago, which branch has the most power? For Locke, the legislative has the most power. And why, you ask? Because they can punish the executive branch. When the legislative has put the execution of the laws they make into other hands, they have a power still to resume it out of those hands when they find cause, and to punish for any maladministration against the laws. So yes, they made the laws, but then they put the laws in the hands of someone else to execute. But if that person does a bad job, the legislative can take that power away again. This may sound familiar. We kept it. We put it in the Constitution. We call it impeachment. This is from Article 2, Section 4. The President, Vice President, and all civil officers of the United States shall be removed from office on impeachment for and conviction of treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. So this was, again, something that the Founding Fathers took quite seriously. This idea that you did need to separate the powers, but you also needed to give them the power to occasionally topple each other. So yes, the legislative branch has the most power, in part because they can just impeach you if you do a bad job. That said, the executive branch has a little bit of power too, and part of the power that they have has to do with elections, and specifically when the elections are held, how often they're held, if people know they're being held. And so we start with the concept of electing people at all. If the legislative be made up of representatives chosen for that time by the people, This power of choosing must also be exercised by the people, either at certain appointed seasons or else when they're summoned to it. So essentially he's saying that if you're going to have elections, you need to schedule elections. Very sensible. So he thinks that this should be in the hands of the executive power, in part because the legislators can't call it themselves. That would open up room for all sorts of trouble, but also in part because the executive guy is already there. He works there full time. So he lays out two situations. Number one, if the elections happen at known intervals, the job of the executive branch is just to say that they're happening, which, sure. If, however, the election happens randomly, or it's new, or it's unusual, that's when the executive branch has to officially call for the elections. So, yes, we have to have the elections, but the executive branch is the one who says where and when. So since we know that the legislative branch can act on the executive branch, the next question becomes, can the executive branch act on the legislative branch? And further, can they do it for evil? So Locke asks, it may be demanded here, what if the executive power, being possessed of the force of the Commonwealth, because remember he's in office full-time and also he was elected, shall make use of that force to hinder the meeting and acting of the legislative when the original Constitution or the public exigencies require it. So essentially what happens if the executive who has the power to call for elections messes with elections? What if that person, even though the Constitution requires the elections, does something to hinder them? These days we call it meddling. He says, I say, using force upon the people without authority, and contrary to the trust put in him that does so, is a state of war with the people who have a right to reinstate their legislative in the exercise of the power. So Locke's argument here is that if the executive messes with elections, if they mess with the work of the legislative power, they are essentially in a state of war with their own citizens. So his argument here is that if you meddle in elections, you have done something so egregious and so fundamentally wrong that you have essentially declared a state of war against the very citizens that you're supposed to be protecting. So this is kind of something that's happening all over the world. This is something that we're seeing in a lot of countries right now. This is something you might argue we're seeing in America right now. This picture is from the Philippines, and this is what he says. When they are hindered by any force from what is so necessary to the society, and wherein the safety and preservation of the people consists, the people have a right to remove it by force. So I bet you didn't think that John Locke would be advocating for revolution, but here we are. He's essentially saying that if the executive meddles with what is necessary to society, which is our right to vote, our right to preserve our own liberty and properties, they've declared a state of war, and we can then remove them by force. So this use of force might sound excessive, right? We're used to a more peaceful message, especially from all these philosophers. But Locke's argument is that if you are faced with force, you meet it with force. So he says, in all states and conditions, the true remedy of force without authority is to oppose force to it. The use of force without authority always puts him that uses it into a state of war as the aggressor and renders him liable to be treated accordingly. So if trust is placed in you, specifically the trust to run elections, to allow people to exercise their liberties, and you do something bad with it, the only option is to meet you with the kind of aggression that you brought to the table. He says essentially that allowing the executive branch to run the elections means that we allow them a huge amount of trust. He says, the power of assembling and dismissing the legislative, placed in the executive, gives not the executive a superiority over it, but is a fiduciary trust placed in him for the safety of the people. So essentially being the person who is in charge of elections, who is in charge of calling them and administering them, is a huge deal. It's a huge amount of trust that the people are putting in you. And if you do something terrible, like deprive them of their liberties, John Locke argues it is totally acceptable to come back with force, to measure force with force and have a real fight, because the executive is always answerable to the people. So the next thing that John Locke wants to talk about is actually very practical, and that's the idea that the representatives should reflect the population. This is something we've been talking about a lot lately, especially in regard to the Electoral College. But essentially his argument is that as towns change, so too should their representation change. So he says, things in this world are in so constant a flux that nothing remains long in the same state. Which is very philosophical, but he's talking about something quite practical, which is, in the tract of time, this representation becomes very unequal and disproportionate to the reasons it was first established. So he's saying that, sometimes towns grow super fast. Sometimes towns collapse all of a sudden. So you need to keep track of what's happening in the specific area so you can keep track of what kind of representation they need. And I had to include a meme that one of you sent me because I thought this was very relevant. Because we've been talking a lot lately about the Electoral College and the idea that the Founding Fathers had, which was that each state gets 2 senators. But they had no way of anticipating how many people might live in some states, or really how big the country would get and how many states there would be. So this is something that, again, we talk about every 4 years, and then every 4 years we forget. But the idea that the representation should match the population of the state is important, and it is something that we need to continue to address. So this brings us to our final concept of the chapter, which is that you have to do the right thing for your population. So he argues this in Latin. Salus populi suprema lex is certainly so just and fundamental a rule that he who sincerely follows it cannot dangerously err. So what this means is that the welfare of the people is the ultimate law. So Locke's argument here is that essentially, as long as you are always focused on the welfare of the people, on the citizens, on the population, you're probably not going to go too far off track. You're probably not going to make any super dangerous errors. And I think this is a pretty good motto for us to live by. Our final thought, then, is this. Whenever the people shall choose their representatives upon just and undeniably equal measures, suitable to the original frame of the government, it cannot be doubted to be the will and act of the society, whoever permitted or caused them to do so. So ultimately, whoever is in charge, whichever member of the executive branch or legislative branch or king or dictator, whoever is in charge, if they allow fair representation, if they allow fair elections, if they answer to the will of the people, then their society will be as healthy as possible. So, that ends our study of John Locke. I think he had some pretty interesting ideas, some of which we copied verbatim into our Constitution, and I'm very interested to hear what you have to say about it. So I'll see you soon.